Alright guys, I am finally back with another video. So we finally have our rear coilovers and our missing coilover components for the front coilovers. So if you guys didn't know, these coils are actually from the VA chassis. These are super low struts. But what I'm doing is swapping out the lower mounts and the top hats in order to be compatible with the Prius. So we're temporarily going to be using these D2 top hats. As you can see, these don't really go that negative, so I actually have a pair of top hats coming in from Low Life Projects. Whenever those come in, we'll be able to swap those in, and then we should be able to get more camber than these are going to offer. So the reason these coils over here took so long to make is, in case you didn't know, in the world there's a metal shortage. Everything is super expensive right now. Everything has super long lead times. So that, in combination with the fact that Broadway does not make coilovers for the Prius normally. The other thing on top of that is that I'm actually attempting to do what I believe is to be the world's first true rear conversion for the Gen 3 Prius. So normally for the rear suspension you have a strut and a spring and they're both separate systems, but with a true rear conversion you actually combine the two, so it's just a regular traditional coilover just like this. Now the only problem with some cars when you do a true rear conversion is that since the spring rests inside of the fender well, the wheel actually has clearance issues with the spring. So what I did was an inverted BMW design from Broadway in order to offer barrel clearance from the spring. But what we're going to do is open up this box and see what we got. So we've got a lot of packing peanuts. We have our rear coilovers here, and then somewhere in here should be the lower mounts. But I'm going to dig through this box and get all these parts out to see what we got. Alright, so here's what we got in the box. So we got our front lower mounts. So these are going to be going onto the rear, or the front coilovers that I had already. Now these are actually all the same exact dimensions as the Lexus CT200. So if you're interested in doing any of this front suspension work for your CT, it's exactly the same for the front. The rear is different because the Prius has a torsion beam and the CT uses a double wishbone. But basically the concept of these coilovers is they actually mount upside down like this. So that's going to go down, and then you got this singular stud that's going to go through the upper mount bushing. So this is how this is going to mount, and then the spring is located at the bottom to give it that additional clearance from the barrel. So we're going to mock this up in a little bit, and hopefully this fits and all the dimensions that I gave checks out. So here is a basic concept of how this all works. So the coilover is going to be mounted upright like this, with this little M12 washer on there to act as a little stopper for good measure. Now this stud goes through this upper mount bushing like this. This goes through the strut tower. You have one more piece of the bushing that sandwiches on top. Then we're going to have the washers, nuts, and also a strut brace for good measure. So I'll show you guys that strut brace now. So this is the strut brace from Ultra Racing. This is a company in Malaysia, I believe. Now, this was actually a kind of hard item to get a hold of because a lot of the eBay sellers weren't shipping due to COVID. So I actually bought this through a company called Next Gen Tuning. So shout out to them for getting this to me. Now, this is a very simple strut brace. It just bolts in between the two strut towers. Now the reason I'm using the strut brace is because in a divorced suspension system, the strut towers are actually not usually reinforced. They're not designed to take the entire force of the suspension. The spring bucket is actually what absorbs most of the suspension force. Now because we're putting this true rear conversion on, all that force is going to be focused on the strut towers itself. So because of that, we have this additional brace to kind of stiffen the strut towers and make sure they don't deteriorate or break on us over time. So that's the reason we're running the strut brace along with this true rear conversion. So before I go ahead and start test fitting these on the car, what I'm actually going to do is just set them up, which is going to take the longest. So we're going to have to preload the springs, swap the pillow ball bushings on there so that we can run these top hats for now. Preload the springs if I didn't say that already. So I like to preload the spring about 1/8 inch or 3 millimeters, roughly is the equivalent of that. And then once I get all that stuff together and ready, we should be able to throw them on the car and see what happens. So one thing I actually did want to show you guys is these bump stop shims I'm using. So since we're going to be running a super close fender to lip fitment on the Prius, I'm basically setting these up so that these limit the strut travel when the spring compresses. So I just have these two 1/2-inch spacers in here for reference for a total of 1 inch. Now I just stack these accordingly in order to limit the travel of the piston shaft. So hopefully that's going to help us avoid destroying our quarter panels when the suspension does flex. So one thing that I forgot that I wanted to do before I actually preloaded the spring is we're going to have the spring loose, and then we're going to mount up the coilover. Then we're going to jack it up and flex the piston shaft to its maximum depression point to make sure that that point does not have the wheel making contact with the quarter panel. So once again, with the spring loose, we got our bump stops set up, everything like that. We're going to connect it, jack it up, and then we're going to simulate what the suspension and wheel fitment will look like once the suspension flexes fully. Alright, here's the coilover mocked up roughly right now, just to check for clearance. So everything clears perfectly. I just had to trim the exhaust heat shield a little bit, which is no big deal at all. Just cut that up with some tin snips. Now I just have that in place on the strut tower right now. I'm going to go up top and temporarily attach the nut and bolt so that I can flex this suspension and see what the fitment will look like with that piston shaft fully depressed. Then I'll be able to adjust the height from the upper mount accordingly. But everything looks super good. I'm actually surprised this worked out, but I'm super happy. So now I just gotta dial it in, and then we'll be ready to tighten this up, and then it'll be done. So here's what we're working with up top for now. So I'm going to center that stud, put this on top, put the washer on top, then put the final washer and nut on top. We're going to torque this down to 25 foot-pounds. That should be a good amount. And then from there, we'll be able to put the suspension under full flex and set the height. Alright, so we basically have the height all dialed in for this. So what we're going to do is take this off the car, preload the spring, jam these cars together, and then we're going to match the remaining coilover to this one. Then we should be good to put both on, and it should be pretty close. Alright, so now we got both these coilovers set to the same length. So we're going to go ahead and get both of these into the car along with our strut brace, and then the rear should be good to go. So here's what the rear looks like for now. We might actually shorten the piston stroke and go lower in the future, but we gotta see once all four corners are on the ground. So here is the strut brace. Got those torqued down to 25 foot-pounds, and then we torque the bottom nut where the coilover connects to the axle beam to 60 foot-pounds, but I think the actual torque spec is 66, but close enough. Just using the same numbers from my Subaru days. So we got the rear right there. We just put together a front coilover, so we got the D2 top hats on and the lower mounts from Broadway. So I have no idea what height we're gonna set these at, but the main goal for tonight is to get these on and then get the front fenders at least rolled. Alright, so we spent a few hours working on the front. What we ended up doing is using one camber bolt in the top hole, and then also rolled the fenders a little bit. Got our D2 top hats maxed out. So it looks like this is actually good enough for the setup I'm going for now. So I actually might not use the Low Life Projects top hats until later, just so I don't have to take this apart and touch it again. But there's what we're looking at right now. The thing that we're gonna do now is probably lower the rear more, because surprisingly these coilovers didn't really flex when I put it on the ground. So I think we can get it a little bit closer.